Money was never designed to be your master. It was created to serve you, to follow your faith, and to fulfill the purpose God placed within your life. The problem begins when people forget this divine order. They start running after money, worrying about it, fearing its loss, craving its increase, and in doing so, they hand over their authority to something that was meant to be their servant. You are not made to live under the control of money. You are made to live under the authority of God's word, where faith reigns and money obeys. When you walk by faith, you speak from a position of dominion. You begin to command, not beg. You stop seeing money as your savior and start seeing it as a tool that follows your divine assignment. Most people in the world today live under the illusion that money gives power. They believe that the one who has more wealth has more control. But true power does not come from possessions, it comes from purpose. When your heart is anchored in faith, when you know who your provider is, money becomes a vehicle through which divine purpose flows. It is not something you chase. It is something that begins to chase you. The one who lives by faith doesn't bow to financial pressure. He doesn't make decisions based on fear of losing or not having enough. Instead, he listens to God, obeys his instructions, and trusts that every need will be met according to divine timing and measure. The reason money often controls people is because they do not understand its spiritual nature. Money carries the spirit of the one who controls it. When greed or fear is the master, money will lead you away from peace. But when faith and obedience are your masters, money will bow to your spirit and flow in divine order. You must learn to speak to your finances with authority, just as Jesus spoke to the wind and the waves. He didn't plead with the storm, he commanded it. In the same way, faith doesn't beg for provision, it declares alignment with heaven's abundance. You are not meant to serve money, money is meant to serve your mission. Faith operates differently from the logic of the world. The world teaches accumulation, self-preservation, and competition. Heaven teaches giving, trust, and surrender. When you live by faith, you understand that every resource is temporary and every blessing is meant to flow through you, not stop with you. You become a channel of divine provision. Money loses its power to manipulate your emotions or dictate your decisions. Instead of asking, "Can I afford this?" your spirit begins to ask, "Is this what God wants me to do?" That question changes everything because it shifts your focus from possession to purpose. Faith gives you clarity, and clarity gives you mastery. You see, when money becomes your master, you will always be anxious. You will measure your worth by numbers, not by calling. You will start to believe that your future depends on your paycheck instead of your provider. That kind of mindset produces fear, and fear kills faith. But when faith becomes your master, peace takes over. You stop comparing your life to others. You stop chasing temporary gains. You begin to live with a quiet confidence that whatever God calls you to do, He will also provide for. That is what it means to make money obey faith. You don't chase after blessings, you attract them through obedience. The truth is, money is neutral. It carries no moral value by itself. It becomes good or evil depending on whose hand it rests in and what purpose it serves. When it serves your ego, it corrupts. When it serves your vision, it multiplies. If your heart is pure, if your motives are right, money becomes a sacred tool for kingdom work. It builds, it blesses, it feeds, it heals. But if your heart is enslaved to greed, money will drain your peace and distort your vision. The only way to keep money under control is to keep your spirit in alignment with God's will. When faith rules, everything else falls into order. Money follows faith because faith is creative power. The same way God spoke light into existence, faith speaks provision into reality. You must learn to speak from the position of authority that God has given you. Declare that your resources will serve divine purposes. Command your finances to align with righteousness. Refuse to allow fear, doubt, or greed to direct your decisions. Every time you act in faith, you train money to recognize spiritual authority. It begins to flow toward your vision, your giving, your obedience. Faith attracts the provision that matches the assignment. The moment you decide that money will serve you, not the other way around, a shift happens in the unseen world. You begin to operate under a different law, the law of divine order. Heaven responds to faith, not to fear. You stop trying to earn peace through possessions and start experiencing abundance through obedience. Money begins to lose its hold on your heart because you've placed your trust in something higher. When you truly understand that you are a steward and not an owner, every transaction becomes an act of worship. Money becomes a messenger that carries your faith into action. It becomes a reflection of your trust, not your anxiety. You were not designed to serve the world's financial system. You were designed to demonstrate heaven's. When your priorities are right, money becomes a follower, not a leader. It begins to move according to your purpose, guided by your faith, and multiplied by your obedience. The authority God placed in you was never meant to be limited by material conditions. The same faith that heals the sick can command resources into existence. It is not about greed or desire, it is about alignment. When you align your faith with divine order, money takes its rightful place as your servant, and you stand firm as the master under God's authority. Heaven's financial system does not operate like the systems of this world. The world's economy is built on competition, scarcity, and fear. It teaches that the more you take, the more secure you become. But heaven's system is built on generosity, faith, and divine order. It teaches that the more you give, the more you grow. The world's system says to hold tightly to what you have. Heaven's system says to release it with trust. These two systems cannot coexist in the same heart. You must choose which one you will live by, because one is ruled by fear and the other is ruled by faith. Faith is the foundation of heaven's economy, and obedience is its currency. When you walk according to heaven's financial system, you no longer measure success by how much you possess, but by how much you can be trusted with. In God's economy, wealth is not ownership, it is stewardship. You are not the source, you are the vessel. The more open you are to give, the more heaven can pour through you. The world cannot understand this because it operates by sight. It needs to see before it believes. But heaven's system is invisible. It is built on spiritual laws that respond to belief, not evidence. You give before you receive. You sow before you harvest, and you trust before you see the result. The system of heaven begins with surrender. When you surrender your resources, your time, and your desires to God, you step into a realm where multiplication replaces loss. You may not see it immediately, but the spiritual laws are always in motion. What you release in faith never disappears. It is transformed into divine increase. Every act of giving becomes a seed that heaven remembers. Every act of obedience becomes a key that unlocks favor. The law of sowing and reaping is not a religious idea. It is a spiritual principle written into the fabric of creation. The soil of the world's economy is unstable. It changes with markets, interest rates, and inflation. But the soil of heaven's economy is eternal and unshakable. When you sow into that soil through faith, generosity, and obedience, your harvest is not bound by time or geography. It can come from unexpected places and in unexpected ways. Sometimes it comes through people, sometimes through opportunities, and sometimes through ideas that seem to appear out of nowhere. Faith keeps you anchored, even when you don't yet see the result, because you know the system you are sowing into cannot fail. Heaven's financial system also demands purity of intention. Giving with pride or fear produces nothing, but giving with love and faith produces life. When you give to impress others or to secure your own comfort, you are still operating under the world's system. But when you give out of a heart that trusts God completely, your faith activates divine law. It is not the size of your seed that moves heaven. It is the sincerity of your faith. God is not looking for your money, he is looking for your trust. Once he finds that, provision begins to flow without resistance. Obedience is the structure that sustains heaven's economy. Many people pray for prosperity but ignore divine instructions. They want increase without stewardship and abundance without sacrifice. But in God's system, obedience always comes before manifestation. The smallest act of obedience can open doors that money never could. When you give as instructed, when you forgive as commanded, when you act in faith rather than fear, you are participating in heaven's financial order. Every act of obedience shifts the flow of divine provision in your direction. In this divine system, your seed does not diminish you, it multiplies you. When you release what's in your hand, heaven releases what's in its storehouse. The world cannot understand this exchange because it measures value only by what it can see. But in heaven's economy, unseen transactions are more powerful than visible ones. The moment you give, something spiritual happens. The windows of heaven open, not always immediately with physical wealth, but often with wisdom, favor, opportunity, and protection. These are the currencies of heaven that eventually manifest in material blessing. The most powerful thing about heaven's financial system is that it is immune to crisis. Economic downturns, political instability, inflation, none of these can stop the flow of divine provision. When you live by faith and obedience, your source remains constant even when every human system collapses. That is why the people who live under God's financial order remain at peace during uncertain times. Their faith is not in banks, jobs, or governments. It is in the unchanging promises of God. Faith makes you recession-proof because it connects you to a source that never runs dry. In heaven's economy, generosity is not loss but gain. Every act of kindness, every offering, every seed sown in faith carries a return that far exceeds what was given. The return may not always come in the same form, but it always comes. The system is designed to reward those who trust and obey. You may give money and receive peace. You may sow time and reap opportunity. You may serve others and reap divine favor. Whatever the form, the principle remains. Faith, sowing, and obedience are the engines of heaven's financial system. This is why you must guard your heart from the influence of the world's financial fear. When you operate from fear, you cut off the flow of faith. But when you operate from faith, you override the limitations of the natural. You start to live by supernatural laws that respond to your trust, not your circumstances. The moment you shift your focus from scarcity to abundance, from control to surrender, from worry to worship, you begin to operate in heaven's financial rhythm. It is a system that never fails, a law that never breaks, and a promise that never returns void. True prosperity is not measured by how much you have in your hands, but by how aligned your heart is with God's purpose. The world defines prosperity through numbers, possessions, and status, but heaven defines it through stewardship, generosity, and obedience. When your life is in harmony with divine purpose, everything you touch begins to multiply because it is connected to something eternal. Wealth without alignment is a burden, but wealth with purpose is a blessing. You were never created just to accumulate resources. You were created to distribute them according to divine instruction. The prosperity that flows from heaven begins where selfishness ends and stewardship begins. Stewardship means recognizing that nothing truly belongs to you. You are a manager, not an owner. Every resource in your life, your time, your talent, your income, your influence is entrusted to you for a divine reason. When you understand this, greed loses its grip and gratitude takes its place. You no longer see giving as loss, but as participation in a greater work. You stop asking, "How much can I keep?" and start asking, How much can I be trusted with? True prosperity does not come to those who hoard. It comes to those who can be trusted to let it flow. The more you release, the more heaven can replenish, because God will never allow his channel to run dry. Generosity is the heartbeat of divine prosperity. It is not limited to money, it is a posture of the heart. A generous person gives love, time, service, and compassion freely because they know their source never runs out. Generosity is proof that faith is alive. It demonstrates trust in God's provision and power. When you give with a joyful heart, you make room for more to come. When you give out of obedience, you enter into a rhythm of increase that no human system can replicate. True generosity does not come from abundance, it creates abundance. It is not about the size of the gift, but the sincerity of the heart behind it. Alignment with divine purpose is what separates worldly wealth from true prosperity. You may possess great riches and still be spiritually poor if your life is disconnected from God's will. But when your purpose and your provision are aligned, everything you have begins to serve a higher cause. You start using money as a tool to build, to bless, to heal, and to extend the reach of good works. When you live in alignment, prosperity becomes peaceful. It does not bring anxiety or pride. You stop striving to create success by your own strength and begin to experience a supernatural flow that follows obedience. Stewardship and generosity are two sides of the same coin. Stewardship guards what is given, generosity releases what is needed. When both are active, prosperity becomes sustainable. Many people receive blessings but lose them because they never learned stewardship. Others manage well but never experience increase because they refuse to give. The balance of both opens the door to divine flow. Heaven's prosperity is not a one-time event. It is a continuous cycle, receiving, managing, giving, and growing. The more faithful you are with what you have, the more heaven can trust you with greater resources. True prosperity also requires a renewed mindset. You cannot operate in divine abundance with a scarcity mentality. A fearful mind always focuses on what it lacks, but a faithful mind sees opportunity in every situation. When you understand that your supply comes from heaven, you stop competing and start cooperating with others. You rejoice when others are blessed because you know that your source is not limited. Faith teaches you that increase is not determined by markets or salaries, but by obedience and alignment. Prosperity begins in the mind before it manifests in the material. When your heart is aligned with divine purpose, even the smallest acts of giving carry eternal significance. A cup of water given in love, a seed sown in faith, a word spoken in obedience, these become investments in the unseen realm. Heaven multiplies them in ways that human logic cannot comprehend. The more you align your resources with purpose, the more powerful they become. Money, when submitted to God, turns into a spiritual instrument that transforms lives. Time, when offered in service, turns into eternal reward. Talent, when used for good, turns into legacy. Prosperity is not what you keep. It is what you contribute to the eternal plan of God. The greatest test of prosperity is how you handle increase. The more God blesses you, the more responsibility you carry. Prosperity is not a reward for selfish ambition. It is an assignment for stewardship. When you begin to prosper, your heart must remain humble. Pride destroys what faith builds. The moment you start believing that your success is the result of your own power, the flow begins to slow. Prosperity continues as long as gratitude and humility remain. When your heart stays pure and your motives remain clean, nothing can stop the blessings from multiplying. Living in true prosperity means trusting that everything you release will return multiplied, not because of luck or effort, but because of divine law. Every act of stewardship, every gift of generosity, every moment of obedience becomes a seed that heaven waters. You may not always see the harvest immediately, but it is inevitable. prosperity grows silently, just like a seed under the soil. As long as you stay aligned, the flow will not stop. You will have more than enough not to elevate yourself, but to serve, to give, to build, and to fulfill the vision that God placed inside you. Faith is the invisible currency that governs heaven's economy and transfers unseen resources into visible reality. Just as money moves transactions in the natural world, faith moves transactions in the spiritual realm. Without faith, there is no access to divine provision, because faith is the bridge that connects human need to heavenly supply. It is not emotion or positive thinking, it is spiritual authority in motion. Faith sees what the natural eye cannot see and acts as if it already exists. When faith speaks, heaven responds. When faith gives, heaven multiplies. When faith obeys, heaven opens. Everything that God releases on earth must pass through the channel of faith, for faith is the system through which divine resources are transferred into the physical world. Faith is not built on feelings or circumstances. It is anchored in the unchanging nature of God. The world's economy is unstable. It reacts to politics, to markets, to trends. But faith operates on eternal laws that cannot be shaken. When you walk by faith, you are no longer limited by the boundaries of the natural. You no longer depend on what you can see or calculate. You depend on what God has promised. The invisible becomes more real to you than the visible. This mindset shifts your relationship with money, provision, and opportunity. You stop asking, "Where will it come from?" and start declaring, "It already exists in the Spirit, and through faith, it will manifest." Faith functions through words and actions that agree with divine truth. What you say reveals what you believe, and what you believe determines what you receive. If your words are filled with fear, doubt, and limitation, you close the doors of divine flow. But when your words are filled with faith, gratitude, and expectation, you open those same doors wide. Heaven does not respond to need, it responds to faith. Many people cry out for breakthrough, but never release words that align with God's promises. Faith must speak, because silence is the language of fear. When you declare God's truth over your finances, your work, and your purpose, you are creating spiritual contracts that heaven is bound to honor. The law of faith operates through sowing and obedience. Every seed you sow in faith carries the power to unlock heavenly multiplication. The world says, "See before you believe," but heaven says, "Believe before you see." Faith gives first and receives later. Faith builds while there is no visible foundation. Faith moves when there is no sign of success. That kind of trust draws divine attention because heaven looks for faith. Faith turns your giving into an act of worship, your work into an act of obedience, and your waiting into an act of confidence. Nothing in God's kingdom happens without faith, and nothing can stop a person who truly believes. Faith also carries spiritual authority. It commands the natural world to submit to divine order. When Jesus spoke to the fig tree, to the storm, or to sickness, he was demonstrating the dominion of faith. That same authority is available to every believer who walks in obedience. You can command your finances to align with righteousness, your business to operate in favor, and your household to live under divine supply. Faith does not beg, it declares. It does not fear lack. It proclaims abundance according to divine promise. When you walk by faith, you no longer serve money. Money begins to serve your faith. It flows in the direction of your obedience and assignment. Faith is also a test of endurance. It requires patience when nothing seems to change. In the unseen realm, the moment you believe, something begins to move, but the manifestation often takes time. The waiting period is not a delay, it is a proving ground. It refines your heart, strengthens your trust, and aligns your motives. During this time, you must keep your confession consistent. Doubt will try to whisper that nothing is happening, but faith knows that the harvest always comes after the seed. The invisible work of heaven is often silent but never absent. When you stay firm in faith, what was once invisible begins to take shape in the natural. Faith is not limited to money. It governs every area of life. It brings healing, peace, wisdom, and provision. It is the spiritual currency that keeps heaven's flow active in your life. Without faith, generosity becomes routine and obedience becomes duty. But with faith, every act of giving becomes an investment in eternity. When you give with faith, you are not losing, you are transferring your seed from the natural soil to the divine treasury. Heaven records every act of faith, every seed sown, every sacrifice made. Nothing done in faith is ever forgotten. Living by faith requires a new mindset, one that refuses to depend on logic alone. Faith does not ignore reality, it overrides it. It recognizes problems, but believes in promises greater than those problems. It is the decision to believe in provision when circumstances scream impossibility. It is the courage to act when everything in you wants to wait. This is why faith pleases God. It proves that you trust His word more than the world's system. The person who lives by faith is not driven by fear of loss, but by expectation of increase. They understand that faith is never wasted, and that every act of obedience moves them closer to divine manifestation. Faith is the power that makes heaven's resources visible on earth. It is the unseen force that governs divine provision, multiplies what you have, and sustains what you need. It is the reason the impossible becomes possible, and the unseen becomes seen. It is the language that heaven recognizes, and the law that never fails.